January 18, 1991, 4:17 in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Tripoli, an amphibious assault ship, was a dim warren of blue-lit screens and hushed radio chatter 20 miles off the Kuwaiti coast. The air smelled of coffee, sweat, and recycled ventilation. Commander Peter Doran stood behind the radar station, watching the dark sweep of coastline on the threat display. They were conducting mine-clearing operations, escorting the minesweepers forward, protecting the lanes that would, in theory, allow the largest amphibious landing since Incheon. Doran was tired. The ship had been at general quarters for 3 days straight, but the tension was manageable, predictable. They knew the Iraqis had mines. They knew roughly where. The whole point of this crawling, methodical advance was to find them before they found you. Then, at 4:36 in the morning, there was a sound, not an explosion. Not yet. A metallic scrape along the hull, somewhere deep below the waterline. A grinding, dragging sensation that vibrated through the deck plates. Doran felt it in his boots before he heard it. The radar operator looked up, confused. Then the Tripoli shuddered, a violent, wrenching lurch that threw men against consoles and sent coffee mugs crashing to the deck. The explosion, when it came, was muffled, but massive. It sounded like the entire ship had been kicked by a giant. Alarms shrieked. Damage control teams scrambled. In the chaos, one fact became instantly horribly clear. A $1.2 billion warship, designed to survive anti-ship missiles and modern torpedoes, had just been crippled by a weapon that cost less than a used car. What Commander Doran and the rest of the Coalition Naval Command could not yet fully grasp was this. The mine that had just gutted the Tripoli was not an accident. It was the opening move in a strategic gamble by Iraq. A gamble that would force the most powerful navy in the world to halt, rethink, and delay its offensive plans for weeks. It was a lesson that cheap, indiscriminate weapons, properly deployed, could paralyze precision platforms worth billions. And it was a warning that deception, making your enemy prepare for the wrong war, could be just as deadly as any explosive. If you genuinely appreciate these kinds of carefully researched, detailed historical investigations that go beyond headlines to examine the strategies and systems at work, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is truly the kind of content you value. Chapter 1. The Superfleet meets the sea mine. The mine that struck USS Tripoli was not advanced. It was not even modern by Western standards. It was a contact mine, a floating steel sphere packed with 225 pounds of high explosive, tethered to the seabed by a cable, bobbing just beneath the surface. The technology dated to the First World War, the concept dated to the American Civil War. But on the morning of January 18, 1991, this relic of industrial-age warfare accomplished what Saddam Hussein's Air Force, Army, and Navy could not. It wounded a capital ship of the United States Navy. 3 hours later, it happened again. The USS Princeton, an Aegis-class guided missile cruiser, one of the most sophisticated air defense platforms ever built, was operating in the same area, providing radar cover for the mine-sweeping force. The Princeton was a technological marvel. Phased array radar capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously, vertical launch cells loaded with surface-to-air missiles, a hull designed to survive modern naval combat. At 7:15 that morning, the Princeton struck a mine. The explosion ripped a hole in the hull plating, buckled internal compartments, injured 3 sailors, and knocked the ship's gas turbine engines offline. The Princeton, built to intercept supersonic missiles, was dead in the water, crippled by a weapon that required no electronics, no guidance, and no operator. The strategic equation was suddenly, brutally clear. The coalition had assembled the most powerful naval force since Vietnam. 6 aircraft carrier battle groups, 2 battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, amphibious assault ships carrying thousands of Marines. This armada was supposed to project power, to threaten Iraq's coastal defenses, to support a massive amphibious landing that would pin Iraqi forces in place, while General Schwarzkopf's ground offensive swept around from the west. But the Iraqis had seeded the northern Persian Gulf with an estimated 1,200 to 1,300 sea mines. These mines, mostly Soviet-designed models with designations like LUGE and KRAB, along with some Italian-made Manta variants, were cheap, simple, and terrifyingly effective. A single Soviet contact mine cost approximately $1,500 to produce. The USS Princeton cost $1 billion. The mathematics of asymmetric warfare were undeniable. What made the situation even more dangerous was the shallow, murky water of the northern Gulf. Unlike the deep blue oceans where American submarines hunted Soviet boomers, the waters off Kuwait were brown, silty, and rarely more than 150 feet deep. Sonar was nearly useless. The thermal layers that usually allowed submarine detection simply didn't exist. Every mine had to be found visually, either by divers, by remotely operated vehicles, or by the oldest method in the book, dragging mechanical sweeps through the water and hoping you triggered the mine before it triggered you. The mine that hit the Tripoli had been floating in a known Iraqi minefield, but known was a relative term. Coalition intelligence had identified general minefield areas through satellite reconnaissance, electronic intercepts, and defector reports. But the exact locations, the GPS coordinates, the density, the types deployed, were educated guesses. The minesweepers were supposed to find them, mark them, and clear safe lanes. But minesweeping is slow. Agonizingly, dangerously slow. The Sea Dragon helicopters, massive 3-engine beasts towing sleds with mechanical cutters, could clear perhaps a few square miles per day. The mine countermeasures ships, small, wooden-hulled vessels designed to survive a mine blast, moved at walking speed, their crews knowing that at any moment they might find a mine the hard way. The Iraqis understood this. They may not have had stealth bombers or satellite networks, but they understood the mathematics of denial. You didn't have to sink the American fleet, you just had to make them afraid to move. And fear, properly deployed, could achieve what firepower could not. It could buy time. Chapter 2. The amphibious threat that wasn't. The entire Iraqi defensive strategy in Kuwait was built around a nightmare scenario. A massive U.S. Marine Corps amphibious landing on the Kuwaiti coast. This was not paranoia, it was doctrine. The Marines had been perfecting amphibious assault since Guadalcanal. They had demonstrated their capability at Incheon in 1950, executing one of the most daring and successful landings in military history. The threat was real. The 4th and 5th Marine Expeditionary Brigades, roughly 17,000 combat troops, were afloat in the Gulf aboard amphibious assault ships. They had tanks, artillery, helicopters, and air support. They had rehearsed landings on the Saudi coast. And from Iraq's perspective, a Marine landing would be catastrophic. If the Marines came ashore north of Kuwait City, they could cut off the Iraqi forces occupying the country, blocking their retreat into Iraq. Worse, a landing could threaten Basra, Iraq's second-largest city, and a critical logistics hub. Saddam Hussein had fought an 8-year war with Iran. He knew what happened when your supply lines were cut. He knew what happened when an enemy appeared in your rear. The prospect of U.S. Marines landing behind his frontline divisions was a strategic horror that demanded a response. Chapter 2. The amphibious threat that wasn't. The entire Iraqi defensive strategy in Kuwait was built around a nightmare scenario, a massive U.S. Marine Corps amphibious landing on the Kuwaiti coast. This was not paranoia, it was doctrine. The Marines had been perfecting amphibious assault since Guadalcanal. They had demonstrated their capability at Incheon in 1950, executing one of the most daring and successful landings in military history. The threat was real. The 4th and 5th Marine Expeditionary Brigades, roughly 17,000 combat troops, were afloat in the Gulf aboard amphibious assault ships. They had tanks, artillery, helicopters, and air support. They had rehearsed landings on the Saudi coast. And from Iraq's perspective, a Marine landing would be catastrophic. If the Marines came ashore north of Kuwait City, they could cut off the Iraqi forces occupying the country, blocking their retreat into Iraq. Worse, a landing could threaten Basra, Iraq's second-largest city and a critical logistics hub. Saddam Hussein had fought an 8-year war with Iran. He knew what happened when your supply lines were cut. He knew what happened when an enemy appeared in your rear. The prospect of U.S. Forsaturations enter the academy and the enemy. The prospect of U.S. Forsatch first improved the Academy of the newspaper was recognized as the basis for French to subject the trousseau. Marines landing behind his frontline divisions was a strategic horror that demanded a response. So Iraq prepared. They fortified the coast. They dug bunkers, laid barbed wire, pre-registered artillery on likely landing beaches. They stationed 4 divisions, roughly 80,000 troops, along the coastline and in reserve positions inland. These were not elite Republican Guard units. They were regular Army infantry, many of them low-morale conscripts. But they were dug in, and they were waiting. More importantly, Iraq deployed a massive belt of sea mines. They didn't need to build a sophisticated minefield. They needed volume. They needed enough mines to make the Americans stop, think, and delay. Mines cost almost nothing. Defending against them required time, effort, and risk. It was, in economic terms, the perfect weapon for a weaker power. The irony, the beautiful and deliberate irony, was that the coalition never intended to conduct a major amphibious landing at all. General Norman Schwarzkopf, the overall commander of coalition forces, understood something fundamental about war. The enemy can only defend what they think you're going to attack. If you can convince them to defend the wrong place, you've already won half the battle. The real coalition strategy, the Hail Mary plan, was to execute a massive left hook. Ground forces would sweep west into the empty desert, then turn north and east, enveloping the Iraqi army from behind while fixing them in place from the front. The Marines would participate, but they would attack overland, through the breach in the Iraqi minefields and fortifications on the Kuwaiti border. The amphibious force would remain at sea, visible, threatening, but never landing. This was deception warfare at its finest. Not smoke and mirrors, but real platforms, real forces, conducting real operations. The Naval Armada wasn't just a bluff. It was a fully capable invasion force. The minesweeping operations weren't theater. They were genuinely clearing lanes in case the landing became necessary. But the primary purpose was to pin the Iraqis in place, to force them to guard 300 miles of coastline, to tie down 4 divisions that could have been defending the real axis of attack. And the mines made the deception more believable. From the Iraqi perspective, if the Americans were seriously sweeping mines, they must be seriously planning to land. The more effort the coalition put into mine clearance, the more convincing the threat appeared. The Iraqis looked at the meticulous, dangerous, expensive process of minesweeping and concluded, reasonably, logically, wrongly, that the Americans wouldn't do this unless they meant to use it. Chapter 3. The Ocean Trap. The term ocean trap is not hyperbole. A minefield at sea is a specific kind of strategic weapon. Unlike landmines, which deny terrain, sea mines deny maneuver. They don't need to sink ships to be effective. They just need to slow them down, make them predictable, and force them into narrow cleared channels where they become vulnerable to other weapons. The northern Persian Gulf, in early 1991, had become the largest maritime minefield since World War II. Iraq's minefield was not sophisticated, but it was effective. They used primarily 2 types: contact mines and influence mines. Contact mines, the ones that struck Tripoli and Princeton, were moored to the seabed, floating at a preset depth. When a ship's hull brushed the protruding horns on the mine's casing, it completed an electrical circuit, detonating the explosive charge. These were cheap, reliable, and deadly. Influence mines were more advanced. They sat on the seabed and detonated in response to a ship's magnetic signature, acoustic signature, or pressure wave from the hull passing overhead. These were harder to detect and harder to sweep. The Iraqis had acquired them from the Soviet Union and Italy in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War. What made the situation uniquely dangerous was the combination of shallow water, poor visibility, and high traffic. The coalition was operating in confined waters, essentially a maritime choke point, with hundreds of ships maneuvering in close proximity. Every supply vessel, every tanker, every warship heading north had to transit through potentially mined areas. The lanes cleared by minesweepers were narrow, perhaps a few hundred yards wide, marked by buoys. Straying out of the lane, even slightly, could be fatal. And the Iraqis, flying low-altitude aircraft at night, were suspected of continuing to lay mines even as the coalition tried to clear them. It was a nightmare of exponential risk. The USS Tripoli, after being hit, managed to limp back to port under her own power. The damage was severe but not catastrophic. A 1.6 by 2.0 foot hole in the hull, flooding in multiple compartments but no casualties beyond minor injuries. The ship's watertight integrity, the subdivided hull that kept flooding, contained saved her. But the Princeton was more seriously damaged. The explosion had occurred directly beneath a gas turbine engine, buckling the mounting and disabling propulsio. What terrified the naval commanders was not the damage itself, but the implications. If a capital ship like Princeton, equipped with the most advanced damage control systems, trained crews, and robust construction, could be crippled by a mine, what would happen to the amphibious assault ships? What would happen to the thin-skinned logistics vessels, the tankers, the supply ships that kept the fleet operational? A single mine strike on a troop transport carrying 2,000 Marines could turn into a catastrophe. So the operation slowed. The minesweepers continued their work, inching forward, dragging their mechanical sweeps, triggering mines one by one. It was exhausting, terrifying work. The crews knew that the next explosion might not be a controlled detonation of a mine in the sweep gear. It might be directly under their hull. Helicopter crews flying the Sea Dragons, enormous 3-engine beasts towing mine-clearing sleds through the water, operated at low altitude, slow speed, for hours at a time, knowing that a mechanical failure or enemy fire could drop them into the Gulf with no time to react. The coalition's mine countermeasures force was not small. They had dedicated mine warfare ships, the USS Avenger, USS Guardian, and USS Leader, along with British and Saudi vessels. They had the helicopters. They had remotely operated vehicles equipped with cameras and cutting charges, but the scale of the task was enormous. The Iraqis had scattered over 1,000 mines across hundreds of square miles. Finding them all was impossible. Clearing safe lanes wide enough for a full-scale amphibious assault was a weeks-long process. And every day the minesweepers worked. The Iraqi divisions on the coast waited, watching, convinced that the blow was coming. Chapter 4. The Cost of Cheap Denial. The economic calculation of the Gulf mine campaign is stark and instructive. A single Soviet contact mine, a design from the 1960s, cost approximately $1,500. Iraq had purchased or produced over 1,000 of them. The total cost of the Iraqi minefield was likely under $2 million, less than the cost of a single modern jet fighter. Against this investment, the coalition deployed 6 Sea Dragon helicopters, unit cost approximately $30 million each, 4 dedicated mine countermeasure ships, cost $200, $300 million each, remotely operated vehicles, specialized sonar systems, and hundreds of personnel trained in explosive ordnance disposal. The cost of the coalition's mine countermeasures force exceeded $500 million, but the real cost was not measured in dollars, it was measured in time. Time was the strategic currency that mines traded in. Every day spent clearing lanes was a day the Iraqis could prepare their defenses, a day they could reposition forces, a day the coalition timetable slipped, and time created risk. The longer the fleet remained concentrated in the confined waters of the northern Gulf, the more vulnerable it became to other threats. Diesel submarines, anti-ship missiles, even coordinated aircraft attacks. The mines also imposed a psychological cost. After Tripoli and Princeton were hit, every sailor in the fleet understood that the ocean itself had become hostile territory. The water was no longer a highway, it was a minefield. Ship captains became cautious, even paranoid. Standard operating procedures changed overnight. Ships that had previously maneuvered freely now stuck rigidly to cleared lanes. The aggressive forward posture of the early campaign, battleships pounding shore targets, cruisers parked off the coast, was replaced by a more cautious, distant stance. The battleships USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin, both called back from retirement to provide 1/6-inch naval gunfire support, had been bombarding Iraqi coastal positions for weeks. Their massive shells, each weighing as much as a small car, could reach targets 20 miles inland. The sheer terror of a battleship bombardment was a psychological weapon in itself. But after the mine strikes, even these armored giants pulled back. The risk was too great. A mine strike on a battleship was unlikely to sink her. The Iowa class had been designed to survive torpedo hits, but it could disable her, and a disabled battleship was a propaganda gift to Saddam Hussein. The irony was that the Iraqis themselves were terrified of these ships. Iraqi prisoners later reported that the battleship bombardments were one of the most demoralizing experiences of the war. The sound of the 1/6-inch shells passing overhead, a freight train roar followed by earth-shaking explosions, convinced many Iraqi troops that resistance was futile. But from Baghdad's perspective, the fact that these ships were still afloat, still firing, was proof that the minefields had failed. They didn't understand that the minefields had already succeeded. They had done their job, not by sinking the fleet, but by slowing it. Chapter 5. The Invisible Invasion Force. While the mine clearance operations crawled forward, the deception campaign intensified. The coalition wanted Iraq to believe that an amphibious landing was imminent, inevitable, and massive, so they staged the largest amphibious rehearsal in modern history. On February 11, 1991, Marines conducted Operation Desert Sabre, an amphibious landing exercise on the Saudi coast south of the Kuwaiti border. Amphibious assault ships launched landing craft and helicopters. Tanks and artillery rolled ashore. Aircraft provided close air support. The whole performance was conducted in broad daylight, close enough to the Iraqi lines that every move could be observed. The message was clear. We are practicing. We are coming. The Iraqis watched. They noted the number of ships, the types of landing craft, the sequence of operations. They estimated the size of the force, and they reinforced their coastal defenses. But the most effective deception was not the rehearsal, it was the mine clearance itself. The coalition's minesweeping operations were genuine, methodical, and visible. They followed textbook procedures: identify the minefield, mark the boundaries, clear lanes systematically, mark the lanes with buoys. This was exactly what you would do if you were preparing for a real amphibious assault. The Iraqis, watching coalition helicopters towing mine-clearing sleds day after day, saw proof of intent. What they didn't see was that the cleared lanes were not wide enough for a full-scale landing. The cleared areas were sufficient for limited operations, for special forces raids, for evacuating casualties, but not for the kind of mass assault that would require dozens of landing craft moving simultaneously, deploying tanks, artillery, and thousands of troops. The coalition was clearing minimum lanes, enough to keep the threat plausible, not enough to commit to the operation. The naval bombardment continued as well. The battleships, cruisers, and destroyers maintained a steady shelling of Iraqi coastal positions, command bunkers, and radar sites. This served multiple purposes. It degraded Iraqi defenses, making a landing easier if it became necessary. It kept Iraqi troops pinned down, unable to rest or resupply, and it reinforced the deception. Why would you bombard the coast unless you intended to land there? The naval aircraft from the 6 carrier battle groups flew strike missions against targets throughout Iraq, but they paid particular attention to coastal defenses. They hit artillery positions, troop concentrations, supply depots, anything that could threaten an amphibious force. Again, the pattern suggested preparation for a landing. The Marines themselves were believers. Many of the Marines afloat on the amphibious ships expected to land. They had trained for it. They had rehearsed it. They were ready. The ships were positioned, the lanes were being cleared, and the orders could come at any moment. This readiness was itself part of the deception. Intercepted Iraqi communications suggested that they were monitoring coalition radio traffic, and a force that believed it was about to land would sound different from a force that was faking it. But the real genius of the deception was that it didn't require lying. Every element was genuine. The Marines were a real threat. The ships were real. The mine clearance was real. The bombardment was real. The only lie was one of omission. The coalition simply didn't tell Iraq that the main attack was coming from a completely different direction. Chapter 6. The storm breaks elsewhere. On February 24, 1991, the ground war began. But it did not begin with a massive amphibious assault on the Kuwaiti coast. It began with a two-pronged defensive: Saudi, Kuwaiti, and Marine forces attacking straight north into Kuwait, and American heavy armored divisions sweeping west into the Iraqi desert, then turning east to envelop the Iraqi army. The Marines attacking into Kuwait, the 1st and 2nd Marine divisions, were not coming from the sea. They were attacking overland, through breaches in the Iraqi minefields and fortifications on the Saudi-Kuwaiti border. These breaches had been prepared by combat engineers using mine plows, explosive line charges, and brute force. The Marines advanced rapidly, supported by airstrikes and artillery. They bypassed Iraqi strongpoints, isolated Iraqi units, and drove toward Kuwait City. Meanwhile, the amphibious force remained at sea. The cleared lanes remained unused. The ships stayed offshore, visible on Iraqi radar, maintaining the illusion that the landing could still come. Iraqi commanders watching the ground offensive unfold expected at any moment to receive reports that the Americans were landing behind them. They had 4 divisions positioned to defend the coast. Those divisions were not fighting. They were waiting. The deception held even after the ground war started. On the first day of the offensive, coalition naval forces conducted a feint, a series of movements and actions designed to look like the preliminary phase of an amphibious landing. Naval gunfire intensified. Helicopters moved closer to shore. Small boat teams probed the beaches. The Iraqis, already under pressure from the ground assault, saw this activity and believed the second blow was coming. They held their coastal divisions in place, defending against an invasion that would never happen. The main coalition offensive, the Hail Mary envelopment through the western desert, proceeded with devastating speed. U.S. heavy divisions, led by M1 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, smashed through light Iraqi defenses, then turned east into the Republican Guard formations. The combination of speed, firepower, and surprise was overwhelming. Iraqi units, expecting to fight a defensive battle along prepared lines, found themselves attacked from directions they hadn't anticipated, by forces they couldn't see, due to sandstorms and superior American thermal sights, and destroyed before they could react. Within 100 hours, the war was effectively over. Iraqi forces were in full retreat. Kuwaiti sovereignty was restored, and the 4 Iraqi divisions guarding the coast against an amphibious landing that never came had played almost no role in the actual fighting. They had been fixed in place, rendered irrelevant by deception. Chapter 7. The Scoreboard and the Permanent Lesson. The final accounting of the Gulf naval mine campaign is instructive. The Iraqi minefield cost under $2 million to deploy. It damaged 2 major U.S. distant gases. Warships delayed the naval campaign by weeks and tied down a significant portion of the coalition mine warfare assets for the entire conflict. The mines did not prevent the coalition victory. Nothing could have done that, given the overwhelming disparity in capability. but they complicated the plan, imposed caution, and forced adjustments. More importantly, the combination of cheap mines and credible deception achieved a strategic effect. It pinned 4 Iraqi divisions to the coast, far from the actual fighting, rendering them combat ineffective without firing a shot. The lesson was clear, though not always heeded. Low-cost denial weapons, properly employed, can shape a campaign even against a vastly superior opponent. You don't need to win every engagement. You don't need to sink the enemy fleet. You just need to make them slow down, think twice, and commit resources to a problem you created for pennies on the dollar. The mine threat in the Gulf did not end with Desert Storm. After the war, coalition mine warfare assets spent months clearing the remaining mines. They found hundreds of them, some in the original Iraqi minefields, some that had broken free from their moorings and drifted into shipping lanes. The cost of clearing these mines far exceeded the cost of laying them. The ratio of offense to defense, in this case, favored offense by orders of magnitude. The broader lesson about deception is equally important. The amphibious force was never a bluff. It was a genuine capability, held in reserve. But its greatest value was not what it could do, it was what it forced the enemy to prepare for. By creating a credible threat on the coast, the coalition forced Iraq to defend everywhere, which meant they defended nowhere effectively. The divisions guarding the beaches could have been deployed to reinforce the real battlefield, where they might have prolonged the fighting. Instead, they sat in bunkers, watching the empty horizon. This is the enduring challenge for any military planner. How do you allocate finite resources against multiple threats? The coalition solved this problem for Iraq by presenting them with 2 threats, one real, one credible but false. Iraq chose to defend against both. They divided their forces, weakened their response, and ultimately failed to stop either. The Gulf War demonstrated that even in an age of precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft, and satellite surveillance, old-fashioned weapons and ancient principles of war, deception, economy of force, fixing the enemy in place, remained devastatingly effective. The sea mine, a technology from the 19th century, crippled 2 advanced warships. The threat of an amphibious landing, an operation that never happened, pinned down 80,000 Iraqi troops. The coalition won the war through superior technology, training, and firepower, but they shaped the battlefield through deception and cheap denial weapons. For future adversaries studying this campaign, the lesson is uncomfortable. You cannot afford to ignore the low end of the spectrum. A peer competitor with advanced capabilities is still vulnerable to simple, cheap, mass-produced weapons if those weapons are used intelligently. Mines are easy to dismiss as obsolete, as relics of a bygone era, but they remain one of the most cost-effective ways to deny access, slow in advance, and impose caution on an opponent. And for the planners of offensive operations, the lesson is equally stark. Deception works, but only if it's credible. The coalition's amphibious deception succeeded because the forces were real, the preparations were genuine, and the threat was plausible. A bluff can be called. A credible threat must be defended against. The Marines never landed, but they might have. That uncertainty was enough. The ocean trap of the Persian Gulf, 1991, was not a decisive battle. It was a shaping operation, a constraint that forced adjustments, delayed timelines, and fixed enemy forces in place. But in the calculus of war, shaping operations can be as valuable as decisive ones. The mines and the deception, together, created the conditions for the coalition's overwhelming victory. They were cheap, they were simple, and they worked. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling lesson of all. In war, elegance and expense do not guarantee success. Sometimes the simplest, cheapest, oldest weapons, properly employed, can change the balance of power. And a credible threat, even one that never materializes, can be as powerful as a real attack. The laughter, if there ever was any, had long since stopped.